that the great opportunity to engage with politics is something that professionals should not turn aside, and that's why Gaurav has joined me in trying to create a platform in which professionals can engage with political ideas. But I wanted to say just a brief last word, as I was asked to, on the MPLAD's issue before turning to the theme that Gaurav has asked me to address today, which is reforming the Indian Parliament. But on the MPLAD's issue, I think all the MPs who expressed their views gave a very, shall we say, empathetic account of the range of concerns that most MPs have about the MPLADs. On the one hand, we can't say we don't want it, though Sushmita said it sometimes is more of a headache, but you can't say you don't want it because it's the only thing you've got to actually do specific concrete work in your constituency. The theoretical argument, which was advanced by my former colleague Manish Tiwari in a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, that argued that MPLAD was unconstitutional because it blurred the distinction between the legislature and the executive. Manish lost that case in the end, so we are allowed to have our MPLAD's funds. But the argument overlooks the fact that in any case, most of the public not only doesn't understand the difference between the legislature and the executive, but doesn't even understand the difference between the MP, the MLA, the councillor, the panchayat member. So for that reason, trying to stand on too much of theory doesn't make a lot of sense, because when the councillor is not able to do something, people will come to the MLA, and when the MLA is not able to do something, they'll come to the MP, and the assumption is basically we all have the same sets of responsibilities. And it takes, particularly in my state of Kerala, where the voters are demanding of the attention and time of their political representatives, it becomes very difficult to explain that you've actually elected me to do a job in Delhi. They want you here, and they want you attending to their potholes and their garbage disposal here right now, not in Delhi. So that is a genuine challenge. So that's one aspect that must be borne in mind. The second is undoubtedly, it's already been mentioned, the size of the amount of money available to all of us. Most MPs, and I know it varies slightly from constituency to constituency, but I would say the majority of MPs probably cover 7 assembly constituencies. In my case, that is the case. Now, in Kerala, now this again varies from state to state, but in Kerala, each MLA disposes of 6 crores of development funds. 1 crore directly given to him to spend, and 5 crores that he can earmark in the state government's budget. Whereas the MP has 5 crores divided by 7 constituencies, less 25% that can only be spent on SC and ST projects, which means for general purposes, we have 50 lakhs per constituency, where the MLA has 6 crores. So you can imagine my predicament. The shrewd MP, particularly if he works for another party than mine, will usually say, look, I am a small man, I don't have enough money. Go to the MP, he's a big shot. But he has 12 times the amount of money at his disposal than the MP has. So the amount of money is indeed modest by comparison, not just with absolute needs, which everybody mentioned, Jaydev Galla mentioned, others have talked about this, but also in relation to what others amongst the elected representatives have available. So my simple guidance would be to say that the MP should dispose of 7 times the amount of money that the MLA does, according to the state in question. Then only would parity be fairly restored. And the third aspect that others have raised also today about the way in which the money is spent. You've seen from the brochure, from the report that Gaurav and his team have released, that there are a number of different kinds of things MPs have done with the money. And in my case, because the money is so small, I tend to do more small projects. For my 50 lakhs, I would get about 15 crores worth of requests every time. So rather than going in for a big project, which will wipe out the entire 50 lakhs, I tend to go in for small ones of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lakhs, and thereby make 10 requesters happy, rather than go in for a big project that only makes one part of one assembly constituency happy. Now this again, each MP will have their own approach. Certainly for the Rajya Sabha MPs, it's much easier because they don't have to go back to the voters and they can spend anywhere in the state. I remember Arun Shourie telling me that he spent, in those days it was 2 crores, he spent his entire 2 crores in one shot by giving it to an IIT in his state. That was it. The entire 2 crores gone, one signature, one letter. He didn't have to worry about MP funds again. A Lok Sabha MP can't do that because he will have a heck of a lot of angry voters if he does that in his constituency. So those are just by way of a few observations complementary to the discussion we've already had. But I want to compliment Gaurav and his team of colleagues who've done a very interesting report, and I urge you all to read in some detail. And having heard the discussion amongst the MPs, you may want to read between the lines as well to understand exactly how this scheme works in the minds of the MPs who have to implement it. Now, coming back to the larger question of reforming Parliament, which is what Gaurav had asked me to address to all of you today. Parliamentary reform is a vexed question in all sorts of ways, because there are many, many aspects to this question, and for the younger students here, I'm going to commend to you 2 articles of mine last year in Open magazine. One is an essay called The Crisis of Representation, where I've gone in much more detail than I can today in front of you about this problem of parliamentary reform. And the second is a review of a book called Public Institutions in India, edited by Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Milan Vaishnav, and Madhav Khosla, which is a very impressive, very fat, very dense volume that looks at all of our public institutions, including Parliament, through the prism of seeing how those institutions are meeting the challenges of our society today. So I would urge those of you who are interested in more in-depth, my more in-depth views on these issues to please look up those 2 articles, www.openthemagazine.com, and then you can search for me and you'll find these articles. But let me nonetheless touch base on a few things specifically. None of us, I think, in Parliament would pretend that the institution is working perfectly. It clearly is not. I think Madhavan of PRS has made almost a cottage industry out of a series of articles, reports, and op-eds in which he has laid out in some detail the decline in the performance of Parliament since it first came into existence in 1952. He's talked about, for example, the decline in the number and frequency of sessions, the length of the sessions, the number of hours devoted, the quality as well as the length of discussion of legislation before legislation is adopted. And he has also talked about did I say already, the number of hours that are lost to disruption, that are spent on actual functioning, all of which have shown a dramatically steady decline in the last nearly 70 years, or 65 years of Parliament's functioning. Before that was the Constituent Assembly. Now, if you look at this, you're looking at, unfortunately, a very sad story. And the question has to be asked, why? Obviously, a number of factors can be raised, but I don't think that would be a useful conversation today. We are where we are. How do we fix it? How do we make it better? Now, I would argue that one of the first challenges we've got has come from something adopted out of the best possible intentions, and that is the anti-defection law. The anti-defection law was passed by Rajiv Gandhi's government in order to end what had become a really disgraceful practice of what was called Ayaram Gayaram politics, in which MLAs in many state governments, and also at that point earlier MPs in the late 70s, had been switching from side to side in order to gain, if you like, power or the loaves and fishes of office. Now, some of you who know my views and my other writings know that I personally prefer the presidential system to the parliamentary, because I believe the parliamentary system betrays the fundamental principle of separation of powers that, to me, is at the heart of all political representation. That is, you must have a separate executive, a separate legislature, and a separate judiciary, whereas in the parliamentary system, the executive emerges from the legislature, and therefore that separation is not there, and true accountability is not possible. But that's a different argument, and I won't go into that today. On that also, I have an essay that you can Google. I've published my views on all of these issues, so it's nothing terribly new. But once you accept the logic of the parliamentary system, which is that you form the executive from the legislature, then the question that comes up is, how free are people to speak? Now, before the anti-defection law, they were free to do so. After the anti-defection law, frankly, they are no longer free to do so, because the anti-defection law penalizes not just defection, it also penalizes disobedience of a party whip. And unlike in the past, when party whips were relatively rarely issued, today's practice is that party whips are routine and automatic. That is, that for every bill and for every debate, the party tells you what stand you must take. Now, this means that ultimately the independent voice of the legislator has ceased to exist in our country. I've talked about in the past the famous theory of Edward Burke, who in 1774, in a speech to his own voters in Bristol, said, listen, I owe you not just my hard work, but my judgment. So once you vote for me, don't tell me how to vote. Don't tell me how to debate in Parliament. You are sending me to speak for what I judge to be your best interest, not what you tell me to do. This is a very, very famous speech, and it goes to the heart of the whole concept of what an MP's responsibility is. Today, not only are we not in a position to say that to our voters very often, but we are not in a position to say that to our parties, because we go to Parliament not just to exercise our individual judgment, but to follow the dictates of our political party. That is ultimately the logic of the anti-defection law. And if we disobey a party whip under the anti-defection law, we can not only be given a show cause notice by the party or suspended by the party or expelled by our party, we can be expelled from Parliament itself. Now, this is a quite dramatic disincentive. If you have fought hard to get elected, spent a lot of your supporters' money, and arrived in order to advance a certain set of political convictions, you're not going to let any one issue in which you may disagree with your party result in your expulsion. So this has severely undermined the quality of the performance of legislators. Indeed, it has all sorts of other examples because what happens, for example, in Parliament nowadays is that many MPs do not see any need to study the bills that are coming before them because they know that they don't have any input in deciding what the position of the party is. The party leadership will assign somebody to speak, maybe 2 people if it's a long enough debate, or 3 people if it's a really lengthy debate. They will do their work and they will come and speak broadly within the guidelines given by the party. And the others will simply have to vote along with the party anyway, so why bother? And this has also affected the quality of the work that many MPs find themselves doing. In addition to that, of course, is that the whole question of the whip system needs to be re-examined. The Law Commission, in its 170th report as far back as 1999, when the anti-defection law was only 15 years old, had suggested that political parties should not be allowed to issue whips except when the government is in danger. That's a reasonable thing. So when there is a confidence vote or a vote on the budget, where if the government loses, the government will fall, then you can issue a whip. But on all other issues, say to MPs you have to vote your conscience and you have to exercise your own judgment and speak, you will have a much more democratic House. And you will have a much more accountable legislature. So the first reform that we need to look at is how to amend the anti-defection law and the whip system so that we can free parliamentarians from the shackles in which they have been confined now for the last 33 years. A second challenge that has come up in Parliament is reflected in the practice of disruptions. I was horrified when I first came here and discovered these practices where the BJP, then in the opposition, would march into the well of the House and paralyze the House, and indeed paralyze, in one case, an entire winter session of Parliament when no business was transacted because they were disrupting every single day. And sadly, I have to admit the same practice, though perhaps more mildly, has continued with the BJP in government and the Congress in opposition. I have joked, not entirely humorously, that those of us who've gone to missionary schools were taught the golden rule: thou shalt do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, in politics today, the new golden rule is do unto others what they have done unto you. So the BJP has done unto us 10 years of disruption. It looks like we are determined to give it back, at least for the 5 that we expect to see them in government. And that is, to my mind, a great pity. Now, one of the reasons this happens is, well, there are 2 reasons. One is the parliamentary system itself, which I've often criticized, namely that once you have a majority in parliament, as the BJP clearly does, then it doesn't matter how good the arguments of the opposition are, the BJP will always get its way. In fact, I can recount tales of even commonsensical interventions by opposition MPs, which have been routinely shouted down, even when the ruling party MPs are nodding in agreement with the opposition speaker while he's speaking. When the vote comes, automatically their majority prevails. There's no discussion. I can give you one very simple example that affected me, because I was the one who suggested it. During the last year, a very routine bill on labor rights, which we were supporting the BJP on, we were supporting the government, because we ourselves had initiated such a legislation. It hadn't come to the House earlier. It was a law that said that in every factory above a certain number of employees, that the workers will be told their rights in writing. That they'd be given a piece of paper telling them, these are your rights, minimum hours, so much work, so much leave, so much salary, etc. So when the bill came, I realized there was one obvious omission. And I said, look, in a country where still 1/5 of men and 1/3 of women are still illiterate, in addition to giving it in writing, they should also be told orally what their rights are, because that's how they'll understand what they're entitled to. And while I was saying this, many BJP MPs are nodding, this is right. So my amendment was put to a vote, and they all said no when it came up, and because they had no instructions from the government to amend it. So one of the reasons that frustration exists is basically, if you are not in the majority, you never get your way. It's as simple as that. And this is not new. I remember a wonderful comment by former Prime Minister Vajpayee when he was in the opposition, where he said after a particularly pungent debate, he said to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, he said, "Madam, we have the arguments, you have the votes. But that you have the votes is acknowledged, you're going to win." Now, this whole logic that the government will propose, the opposition will oppose, and in the end the majority vote will dispose, limits Parliament, and in many cases disruption happens because the opposition says that the best way to show the strength of our feelings on some issue is to disrupt rather than to debate, which I think is a great tragedy, because obviously the purpose of Parliament as a deliberative forum, a forum for discussion, is lost in that process. So one suggestion that I have is borrowed from other parliaments. I think the German parliament has it, 2 or 3 other democratic parliaments have it, and I've mentioned it to the Speaker of our House, which is, why don't you allow 1 day a week the opposition to set the business of the day? Then they have no excuse to disrupt, because if the issue that the government is not letting them raise, and therefore they're disrupting, can be raised by them when they want to raise it, that would solve the problem. Or alternatively, say every day of all 5 days of the week, opposition is allowed to raise one issue and the government cannot block it. Now, there are some such formulae that could be created, and in exchange there should be a grand bargain, there should be no more disruption. That would be a second reform that could be done. A third reform is the right to call sessions. You know that it's very interesting that we are relatively rare in the world in being a parliament which cannot, by law, convene itself. What normally happens is the government calls parliament, and there is a presidential summons that decides when parliament is going to meet. Now, this would even be tolerable if there was a more or less predictable pattern. Again, I don't want to play partisan politics. MPs from many different parties are sitting here, but I would say that during UPA's time, by and large, you could predict roughly the sessions of Parliament down to within a week or so. But we are now seeing a very different system, where the government has shifted the goalposts in terms of the dates of Parliament to suit its own convenience. Whereas in a country like Germany, for example, you have the parliamentary calendar years in advance, literally, the actual dates that Parliament will meet. Or in a country like Britain, Parliament is permanently in session except for some very well-defined holidays. In India, it's now become a case of complete guesswork, The winter session, for example, which historically and traditionally has been called around the third week of November, got called just on the 18th of December this year, which is, as you can imagine, a considerable distance. Many people who had made plans between Christmas and New Year suddenly found that they were missing Parliament or had to be here at the expense of their plans. Some sort of predictability is worth bringing into the system with an agreed broad calendar, which should be agreed, of course, by all party representatives. The second aspect of calling sessions should be the right of MPs of a defined number to call a session when they judge it necessary, especially at a time of national emergency. It's very instructive, for example, that when the Chinese invaded India in 1962, in October 62, and the war, as you know, didn't last too long, but when it went on, it was intense and the whole nation was seized of it, a young opposition MP called Atal Bihari Vajpayee asked for a session of Parliament to be convened. Normally, the winter session would have been third week in November. He wanted it sooner. Prime Minister Nehru agreed. And the session was called, I think it met in something like the 7th or 8th of November, much earlier than normal, in order to debate the national emergency caused by the war with China. And in that debate, by the way, there was no anti-defection law in those days, as I told you, so no whip, nothing. Prime Minister Nehru took criticism from his own party. There's a famous example of Mr. Mahadev Mishra, who, when Nehruji talking about Aksai Chin said that, you know, it's a snowy desert wasteland, not a blade of grass goes there. Mahadev Mishra was a backbencher from Mr. Nehru's own party, stood up and pointed at his bald head and said, not a hair grows here, will you give this to the Chinese too? I mean, this was the kind of freedom that we used to have in Parliament in those days. So I think that's extremely important for us to do it. And so having a constitutional provision under which, for example, a session must be mandatorily convened if, say, 10% of MPs, that means 55 MPs today, demand it, that would probably be worth introducing. And certainly for this winter session, there would have been 55 signatures for a session earlier that the government had actually found inconvenient to convene. One other suggestion, I think my friend Jay Panda may have already written this, is a suggestion that we could replicate the British idea of Prime Minister's question hour. It's rather striking that in Britain, this is the highlight. If you go on YouTube, you can just Google Prime Minister's question hour. It's incredibly popular. It's been watched by far more people abroad as well to see the Prime Minister of Britain being questioned and grilled in very blunt terms by opposition MPs for 1 full hour. We not only have nothing like it, even when in the listed question slot of question hour, it's the Prime Minister's turn, he never stands up to answer. It's always the Minister and the PMO who answers. And indeed, our Prime Minister for the last 3 years has been hardly present in Parliament. At one point, I calculated in detail that he had made more speeches in foreign parliaments than he had in his own Lok Sabha. You know, it would not be a bad idea if such a reform could be brought in. I think it would also enhance the sense of accountability of the Prime Minister to Parliament, but also certainly enhance the interest in Parliament on the part of the nation as a whole. A fifth point relates to the need to improve the quality of resources available to MPs. There are some genuine frustrations. We are still very much mired in paper. We don't have, you know, even if you have your own iPad or laptop and the government actually gives you a loan to buy it if you can't afford it, even then, it doesn't work in Parliament because there's a jammer on. So if there's a debate going on, you want to verify some point, there's nothing you can do because there is simply no connectivity where you're sitting inside the chamber to be able to look up a fact or challenge a statement by the government or whatever. Not possible. You cannot go on the internet. Similarly, there is a real challenge in terms of staff support and office space. You know, it really makes you envious to go to the American Senate or Congress and see how every elected representative, whether one of the 435 congressmen or one of the 100 senators, is given an office by the government in the office building, Senate office building and congressional office building, and a certain number of staff paid for also by the government, so that the result, or by the funds voted by Congress for the purpose, with the result that everybody is adequately resourced, has a decent place to receive their constituents, has also got staff support to do the necessary research, bill writing, all of this stuff. And as a result, the voter is getting, the taxpayer is also getting better value for their money. We don't have anything like this in India. We have a very modest constituency allowance, which is 30,000 rupees currently. You tell me how many people you can hire for that. The average Lok Sabha MP is supposed, out of his or her own pocket, to maintain an office in Delhi, an office in the constituency, staff in Delhi, staff in the constituency, car in Delhi, car in the constituency, offer chai to people from the constituency in both places, etc., etc. And given that in addition to the 30,000 constituency allowance, they have the princely salary of 50,000 rupees, you can imagine how many MPs who are not of independent means are able to do justice to what is legitimately expected of them in terms of preparation. So at the same time, there's a lot of hypocrisy. I remember when I first came from the UN and discovered my salary as not just an MP but a minister to the government of India was 16,000 rupees. I was in a state of shock, and the person typing my letters was taking home 65,000 those days. But the fact is that this is the hypocrisy built into our system, that we want politics to be a gentleman's profession or a gentle lady's profession, and at the same time we want to be democratic and accessible. We have artificially deflated expense limits for elections also with the same logic. We can't actually show how much money people are spending, because then it will look as if only rich people can contest. So we must have lower sums of money. All of this hypocrisy is part of our system, but it does defy understanding. And I can tell you, when that 16,000 rupee salary was raised to 50,000, then howls of outrage from the middle class in our country, the educated opinion shapers, the mass media, the number of, those days WhatsApp wasn't a big thing, but the number of email forwards and internet sites that commented on how these useless MPs were getting 3 times the money, etc. 3 times the money is 50,000 rupees, folks. I challenge any one of our critics to try and do what we're doing on that kind of money. So this is the question of resources is important. And one final aspect of that is the need for legislative assistance and legislative support. I do believe that we really need, the PRS has been doing a wonderful job in the so-called LAMP program, the Legislative Assistance to MPs, whom they provide at their cost, and they train as well. But that's only, as far as I remember, for 65 MPs. And there are 750 MPs in India, which means that almost 700 of them are not getting this very useful device of a legislative assistant. I think it's extremely important that we address the issue of resources, staff resources and financial resources available to MPs. 6th or 7th point, I've lost count myself, is offered somewhat ruefully, and that is, for God's sake, let's have some system that enables private members' bills to be taken more seriously. It's rather sad that in all the years of Parliament, 65 years, only 14 private members' bills have ever been passed. And the reason that's the case is because you discuss